Over the next month, myself and Josh are preparing to reopen the hall, initially for private prayer, but with the optimism that this will be the first step in being able to gather back together again as God's people in His house to worship together. There's something very special about gathering together to worship, and I'm sure you will agree that whilst we've tried to make the best of coming before God in worship each week, it's not quite the same on paper as it is in real life, in a live worship service. Therefore, in thinking about coming back together, even in the first instance, just to sit quietly, to pray and reflect on what God is saying, I wonder about the beauty of being able to do so and what makes physically being in the building so special. Of course, we know that God does not just dwell within our churches and buildings, but He dwells amongst us. However, has that always been the case? This week's Bible reading, which I mentioned last time I shared with you, speaks about God's home now being among the people, as you see that in verse 3. Knowing that Revelation is written to speak about the end times, I'm left thinking, so where is God dwelling now? So when we think back, did you know that when God created the earth, His intention was to dwell with humankind? That was the whole purpose of Eden, a place where humanity and God dwelled together. The whole purpose of making everything new in Revelation is to allow for that to happen again, this time for good. You see, the only reason humanity was removed from literally walking around with God was sin. That sin distorted the relationship between God and humanity. And in all God's glory and His holiness, humanity could no longer be in that direct presence of God, for their sin was not compatible with God's holiness. However, this intention that God had to dwell with His people doesn't just disappear. In fact, we find that intention consistently making itself known throughout the entire gospel message. Back in Exodus 29:45, God says, I will dwell among the Israelites and be their God. They will know that I am the Lord their God who brought them out of Egypt so that I might dwell among them. The evidence, then, of God dwelling among His people is right there. During the Exodus, God is present in the fire and in the wind. His presence is encapsulated in the tablets of the commandments, which is stored in the tabernacle, which is stored in the temple. That temple in Jerusalem is the witness to the whole of Israel that God dwells among His people. The temple is God's house, and as long as it stands, then God is with His people. However, during the exile to Babylon, people begin to realize that God is not just limited to the temple. His holy presence may well be tangibly felt there, but God still speaks even when the temple lies in ruin. And that's because God dwells with His people and not just in the temple. God is not restricted to a building. The temple is simply the reminder to the Israelites that God is with them. And then God's evidence of His presence with His people then comes in the form of Emmanuel, literally translated to say, God with us. I'm sure that many of you recognise that name, Emmanuel, and surely know I'm speaking about Jesus. John 1:14 says, the Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. We have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. God became flesh. And to show His presence, He walked and talked and physically lived among His people. That's amazing, isn't it? The sheer idea literally blows my mind. It's certainly something bigger than I can imagine. God choosing, despite our faults and failings, humanity's lack of ability to trust and the ability to consistently worship God, still chooses to come and dwell on earth, living out that first intention to come and dwell with His people. That just amazes me. My mind goes to God's love for humanity that brought us into being in the first place. It goes to that compassion that looks to bring humanity back into relationship as He first intended. And it goes to the reality that God is forever faithful and he never gives up. That endurance that held Jesus on a cross so that he might defeat death entirely and once again allow humanity into the holy presence of God. We know that Jesus only physically walked with humanity for 33 years. However, if we recall the ascension and the beginning of Acts, then we will remember that Jesus did not leave the earth and take God's presence with him. His holy presence remained with humanity from that day and dwells with humanity forever within humanity. 1 Corinthians 3:16 says, "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in your midst?" Acts 2 is always so powerful and again something beyond what I can imagine. But I firmly believe it because I know that precious Holy Spirit that was promised is that first intention of God to dwell among humanity. And that has been, is being, and will come into fruition until the day when all things are new. The former things have gone, and God once again literally dwells among his people in moving into the neighbourhood for all eternity. And until that day, God's Spirit dwells in our midst, not because our church doors are open, but because we ourselves are God's temple. God can use a building and can be mightily present in a building, but he doesn't need a building. He just needs us. And so as we look at coming back together again, as we look to return to the church building, and we once again find that time in our day-to-day lives to come and take time away to solely focus on God, I invite you to ask God to dwell within you, not just in church, or not just when you're out and about, sharing with each other, caring for each other, loving one another, but also when you're at home, when you're alone. God's home is among his people, and so my question to you is, are you letting him in to live with you?